I'm thrilled to be talking today with Kriste Dragon. She is the CEO of Pahara, and she's had many roles in education, especially before this role. She was a co founder and CEO of Citizens of the World. It's a national network of tuition free schools serving diverse communities. She's been a middle school teacher, a UCLA instructor, board chair for charter schools, on many, many boards. She's also a moderator for Pahara, for Aspen, and you can see this thread that she's supporting all children to get the opportunities so they can realize their full potential, and also serving leaders so that there can be diverse leaders so they can realize their full potential. So I'm so excited, Kriste, to have you today, especially with your JD from University of Georgia, your bachelor's from University of Alabama, and then also knowing your mom to three kids in Los Angeles. So welcome, Kriste. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, Kriste, you know I care a lot about diversity, equity, inclusion. That's something that we both share. And I want to start with your roots, and particularly thinking about race and gender and reflecting on this fabulous path of impact you've had. How did your beginnings, your culture, your identity shape your path?
It's such a complex question because I think every year that I age, I understand more deeply how pre-wired things have been for me. And maybe for all of us, if we're really in touch with our unique purpose and gifts. But in the beginning of my life, growing up in the South, the American South, spending most of my time between Georgia and then later Alabama, as a racially ambiguous family, or at least the kids, because my parents are of different races, which is much more common now, but at the time actually was just not that common. I think there was always this question of inclusion and belonging. I would have never used those words in my, childhood, but we were searching as a family. I think my parents were explicitly searching, and then I, without knowing it, was searching for a place that I could feel included, actually belong, and found, interestingly enough, that I was accepted most places, because I think when you're ambiguous, especially in a world where that's unique, I think everyone assumes you're a little bit of what they are, maybe. And so I felt like I had access to a lot of places, included everywhere, belonging nowhere, was sort of what I got to by the time I was in my early adulthood. So it's not surprising that I would be obsessed with thinking about places of inclusion and belonging, which I am, especially across lines of difference, socioeconomic, racially, and politically, which were very alive for me in my childhood, especially given that I went to schools during a period of forced busing. And so we had some fascinating differences throughout our elementary, middle, and high school experiences that I think have absolutely shaped the way that I think about what schooling could be, and what the risks we run when it's not what it could be.
Kriste, can you share with us how you identify and your parents and your parents?
Yeah, absolutely. If we didn't know each other in such a small world, I'd say, what do you think? Because that's usually the way that I try to uncover this nutty construct we have of race, and this incredible impact that it's had on all of us as Americans. But I tend to identify as mixed race and don't actually check any other boxes if that's offered. And sometimes I'll just check other. My father is actually Caucasian, born in the South, and grew up at the time in housing projects that were segregated by race. And then my mom is an immigrant from the Philippines. She actually just passed recently of COVID. I don't know that she would have identified as a woman of color, which is interesting, given the way that she presented. But she was 100% about assimilation and believing deeply, as her parents had, that that was the best path for us children to succeed. And it wasn't until much later in her life, when she started to sort of dive into her real passions, and she wasn't as worried about us and how we were going to turn out, that we started to explore the cost of that theory she had, on her, on me, potentially on my kids as well.
Wow. As someone who's Filipino and has full Filipino American, both parents immigrated from the Philippines, born here in the United States, so much of that resonates. And Kriste, I want to go here to this idea, very powerful, that you actually talked with your mom about her choices, with assimilation. I actually haven't done that. I'm thinking I'm leading a professional development on how to have race conversations with parents, particularly AAPI community. So this is
Yeah.
so relevant. And could you share, how did this conversation come up? How did it go? I mean, that's really incredible.
Yeah. I'm probably going to cry. I'm just going to warn you about that. Because the guttural reaction I have to that is just do it soon, because you don't know when they're not going to be around. When my mom, she got COVID, and she was gone like 21 days later. And so I actually thought I had years. We buried my mom's mom 2 years before she died. So in my mind, I've got 20 years with my mom to unpack all these conversations. So my honest answer is I didn't talk enough and deeply enough about it. I am grateful that we did start those conversations, and I do have some things to share on that front. But my headline is treat every conversation like it might be your last, and make sure anything that you want to ask, answer, or talk about is talked about. For us, I think my mom hit a point in maybe her 60s where she had poured so much into ensuring that we were going to be okay. And she really just dedicated her life to her kids. And she was starting to really ask the question about what her purpose was. And my parents were both so good. And I'm sure I'll speak about this at different points in this conversation. But my dad really instilled in us this idea that if you figure out what you were born to do and you do it, the rest will fall in place. So he actually encouraged us not to think so much about, of course, to consider finances and things like that. Like, it was very real that where my parents grew up, that they would be talking to us about that, but that the driver was actually in service of our purpose. And in my family, that was what God put you on the planet to do. And really communicating this idea that, because if you don't do it, it won't be done. Like, you were literally put on the earth to do it, and no one else will pick it up and do it. The world will just miss whatever it was that you were supposed to offer. And so, interestingly, my mom, I think, had raised us that way, but hadn't asked the question of herself. And so she got into her 60s. She ended up discovering what that might be for her. And she ended up doing a lot of teaching and healing body work with the aging population, so her peers, and creating more comfort in people's lives. And so that was the doorway in. It was like, as she was uncovering what potentially had held her back, or what had stopped her from getting into that a little bit earlier, we had conversations. We weren't on the same page, to be frank. Like, I'm pretty sure that if we were here together now, we still wouldn't be on the same page. So I had to really decide if I was talking with her to be understood, or if I was talking to understand her. And I know those two things can coexist, but I actually find in mother-daughter relationships, sometimes they don't. I'll tell you, my biggest regret of those conversations is that I came to most of them as a daughter and not as a woman and friend to my mother. And that's the opportunity that I lost, because I think I spent a lot of time pushing my opinion and trying to make sure she understood why I believed what I believed, and frankly, trying to change her mind about what she believed. And I wonder what it would have been like to just sit with my mother as a woman and let her know that I understood her and she made sense.
Kriste, my deepest condolences.
Yeah.
For your loss.
Thank you. She's still around though. she comes to us in hummingbirds. And so I see her everywhere, frankly, all the time.
The reflection to be with your mom, and it's like Stephen Covey has, well, I think one of his 7 habits, right? It's like, seek to understand before being understood. And I don't know if this is like it for you, but I'll share for me, when I hear some of these anti-Black statements that come out of my family's mouth, I'm just like, and no, I'm not going to understand that. That's just wrong, and I can't. And yet, hearing you, I wonder, like, can I be a friend, and can I listen? Because it's not like our family showed up just with these programmed in their heads. There's a reason for it, and there's stories for it. So if you had sat as a friend, how would you put aside these deep convictions and within yourself, so that you could be the friend? Because that's like, there's self-care there, right? To like not be about the self. And yet, first, before you reach out to others, you got to make sure you're okay. So I'm curious if you have thoughts about that.
Yeah, this may be hard to follow, but this is my initial reaction. I think in very technical terms, if I were to push back on my mom and the over hyper focus on assimilation, at the core of that, there's all kinds of stuff about self-love and not enough of it, and belief in one's own full power and identity. But I don't think that was necessarily the right door to go into. I think what might have resonated for her a little bit better is just this technical idea of there being an external standard, right? Like the way they raised us was to deeply believe that the truth, the beauty, and the power was within us, like God is within us. Yet when you're forcing this assimilation agenda, like it's antithetical, frankly, to what we're being on the one hand told. And so I think my mom had bought into that so much, especially in a beauty standard way. And there was a lot of pain there. And so when I came in as the daughter trying to push my agenda, I was trying to do my own healing work. And I don't regret that. I mean, that my mom's understanding and approval for me is wrapped up in my own self-love and self-care. But what I missed and what I didn't understand, given how much earlier she was gone than I ever expected, is like she was swimming in her own version of that. And the pool was probably twice as wide as mine and twice as deep, And I don't know that I did enough to come alongside her and help her process that, and just wonder if in doing that, I would have unlocked then some of the stuff that lived between us, right? We had a beautiful relationship, so I don't mean to suggest otherwise. And there were some things that were like some places we couldn't go together, probably because we were swimming in the same pool of pain, frankly.
Yeah, there's this idea of generational trauma that's passed, not
sure.
just mother to daughter, but like grandmother and great grandmother. And as the CEO of Pahara, there's so many beautiful readings like Grandmother's Hands, where you're just like, oh my gosh, it's coded into our DNA and our body adapts and holds. And how do you release it? Allowing not just our brains to function and trying to communicate with each other, but actually bringing in the body. So I love your organization and what you do and how you bring about new ways of thinking to heal, and do that also with others and help others heal. So beautiful. Kriste, can you share with us, we're talking about parents, and there's this idea of the sandwich generation. This idea that you're caring for your children and you're also caring for your parents. And so you and I connected on this, and I'd love to do some reflection here as you think about the life, the relationship you've had with your mother, celebrating her still, even like sharing wisdom with others, then also reflecting on your father and the time you have with him. And just like, how do you think about both having an impact in this role as CEO, and you're on so many different boards and have influence on the country, and also there's a consideration that time is limited and we want to value that. So I'd love to, I'm just opening it up in a very general way for you to take it anywhere you'd like.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts about that balance?
It's a really good time to be asking me that question, because as I shared with you, my dad is very sick. He has late stage cancer, and we had no idea until about 4 months ago. And he was presenting perfectly healthy, and then just his bones started breaking, and it was a sign of how long he's probably had the cancer, because it had already hollowed out his bones and is causing all kinds of problems for him. And so I don't have this totally figured out, but I'll tell you the kind of stuff I'm thinking about right now. I don't think I realized when I moved so far away. So when I moved, it was in my early 20s when I moved from Atlanta to LA. And I think in my heart, I thought I would go back. I ended up having children literally 9 months after I landed here, having my first child. And while there's a beautiful career story that I can tell about that, I also think I'm positive that I didn't stop and ask, as my kids get more inundated in their life here, and as my career gets more inundated here, what are the potential transition points to go back? So I never consciously really decided to stay. I just never decided to go back, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So what got missed there is really thinking through what it would mean to live this far from my parents, through the upbringing of my 3 children, through all the highs and lows of life and marriage and parenting, and then especially at the end of their lives, which for my mom was very fast and was probably neither here nor there. For my dad, is playing out to be a real thing. I go back as often as I can, but I don't see him nearly as much as I would like, given what I know is probably not as long of a future together as we had hoped. until like 4 months ago, we had no reason to believe we wouldn't, have years and years together.
When you think about your kids' connection to your dad, I'm curious if any of that comes into play, or it's like, and that's okay if you're like, well, I'm really focused on me spending time with my
Yeah,
dad, which is fine. I'm just curious if the kids
sure.
come into play here.
This is an interesting one because at some point, my kids were like, you haven't taken us anywhere. Like we only go to Atlanta. And I was like, oh, there's another just unrealized choice, unconscious choice that I was making. And it was unknowing. I didn't know any better. We got here and I didn't realize you're going to have a certain number of travel chips, and it's some combination of what you can afford, what days your kids are not in school, and how much vacation you have. And if you live 3,000 miles away, some percentage of those, if you're close to your family, are going to go to your family. Now, if my parents had been able to come out here more often, maybe that would have been different. And we do see each other, until my mom passed and until COVID, we saw each other a phenomenally high number of times, I think, given what it could have been, but it's not the same as coming to all of their events at school, every grandparents' day or whatever. And I didn't think that through when I was putting my kids in their schools. I didn't think to myself like, oh, if we were back home, those thoughts occurred to me, obviously, as I was raising the kids, but then we were so settled here and it felt like pulling our feet kind of almost out of cement, and at the time I was in jobs that were actually based here and I wasn't working nationally. So I wouldn't go as far as to say it's a regret, because I don't think you can pick out the one thing you'd change and have everything else be the same. I deeply believe that the puzzle is what it is. But I do really love conscious decision making, intentional discernment. And I didn't have that frame of mind, partially because of my age and partially because I didn't talk to people about it. I didn't do what I would do at work. I didn't go to like 5 people who had done this before and say, hey, what are the pros and cons? And let me weigh it. And let me do all of that. And so that is what I am coaching my daughters and soon to be my son, who's a little bit younger. But I have one daughter who's out of college, and I'm saying to her, like, listen, there are no bad decisions in a perfect world, but there are trade-offs and choices. And so just be conscious when you're making them, so you're signing up for what you can live with. And I'm watching her, as early as 23, start to really think that through. Like, how close does she want to be to her family? Because she knows what it feels like to have been really far away. And she's very close to my dad still, and was very, very close to my mom.
It's community, something that I've learned a lot, even reflecting through Pahara, that I have taken for granted. So much of what you said resonates, because when I think about my life design, it's been very career oriented. What's the next job? How can I grow, impact? And where is the consciousness also on the family side, particularly with the parents? I feel like that's that. And while trips are great, it's not the same as swinging by the grandparent day, or
Yeah.
just like knowing your friends or being integrated. So I'm curious, like, as you think through, even now, right? Life is, we're not going to, regret past, because things aren't specifically in silos where we won't impact the rest of the picture, the puzzle. But as we think about life in just chapters, not specific to yours, because I don't want to, make it so personal, but as we think about these trade-offs and entrenchments, is there a way, I wonder if there's like, okay, I live right next to my parents, right? And then I live halfway across the world, right? I'm just like getting more polarized about this. Or there's other flexible ways. I'm just in this flux of 5 women. And I'm curious, have you seen other ways that's not next door neighbor or not halfway across the world where people have made it work?
So this is sort of what I mean by just doing it all consciously. Like if I knew then what I know now, I would have like made the priority list I would have sat down with my parents and said, look, I'm going to live in LA. Like that's where my career is. And it's where I felt at the time like I belonged. And that probably is still true. Like I still feel like this is a place I was supposed to have been for the period I've been here. But we could have said, so what does that mean? Like, how much time do we want to spend together? And we could have just made different financial choices, honestly, and prioritized differently long periods of time together. Now, it would have meant we didn't do other things. It would have meant we probably would have been a lot more in partnership around how we thought about real estate, how we thought about where we thought about real estate, honestly. And maybe it even would have pushed them to think about the potential of relocating out here, which we never really talked about. And I don't know why we never talked about that. Like, this is the thing when you get to the end that I'm clear on what we didn't do, but I don't know why. I don't know if we were just busy or if that's just not how my parents were raised and therefore they didn't raise the issue and I didn't either. But I think that while I don't have a specific answer to your question, I do think we didn't give it a good run of creativity to try to figure out what it could have been. So I'm trying to do something different with my kids. I'm trying to say, look, the world suggests that we should all save, retire on our own in separate places, maybe in the same city, but still separately, be very independent of one another. And I think there's another way for us to think about it. What would it look like for us to think about ourselves as a unit, knowing there won't be people added to the unit because I assume my kids will, some number of them will have life partners or whatever. But what would it look like to make a plan around what we prioritize, which, might be that we prioritize being within driving distance so that we're not doing this on our own. I'm not getting old on my own. They're not raising kids on their own. So in my best days, that the conversation looks like that. In my worst days, it looks like me pulling the car over and saying, can you imagine how much easier this would be if I had stayed close to my mother? Like, yes, we understand. So I think we are pretty close to actually making some moves around thinking about property differently than I would have in the way that I was raised, and just thinking like, what does it look like to have a more communal sense of all of it so that we are setting up the life we want, assuming that if I'm really lucky, I'm in the back half of my life. If I'm really lucky, 20, 30, 40 years.
I wanted just to build on what you're saying, because as someone who thinks about career, has thought about career and prioritized career and gone off and not thought about the family unit and even this idea of residence, I'm just like, wow, Kriste, how do you think about that? And also I like thinking about how to have my parents be cared for, but I don't think I'm the right person to be the person to care, trying to release guilt about that. I'm curious, could you say more about residence? Because what does that mean in your mind? Like, is that the mother-in-law house that you're thinking about? Is it by an apartment building and then each person has a little apartment? Like, I'm just curious. I know you're in the brainstorm mode, but what comes to mind when you're sharing properties?
Yeah, bear with me because this is going to feel like maybe a tangent, but there was this really interesting moment when we were developing Citizens of the World and people kept asking us about social emotional work, which, in 2008, we were heavily in our DNA was a component of difference and inclusion, social and emotional development, and what we called core academics at the time. And I would meet people who would say like, oh, we don't do SEL. And I was thinking like, no, you do. You're just not doing it. Everyone does SEL. You've got human beings in your schools. Like, of course you're doing SEL. You just may not be thinking about how you're doing it if you don't, have a more macro plan. And I don't think I realize the same is true for sort of life planning. Like, we're just moving along, saving for retirement and doing these very individual things, but we don't have, or at least I didn't with my parents, sort of a macro like strategy with a why. We weren't operating from a why, a shared why. And I'd like to do something different with my kids. So I don't know where we'll all land as a group. And I don't know what it will look like. I don't know if it'll look like I end up investing more in properties for them so that then they are better set up to take care of me, or I don't know. Maybe it'll look like we all buy one big house together, which is probably my dream, but I have to wait and see if that's their dream because I'm not sure that they want to live with me forever. But I am more understanding of how like that's actually what I come from. Like my mom's family that's still in the Philippines, they are all still living together and they're literally in one house or they're on one huge piece of property and they're sharing literally birth to death life. And so it's not surprising to me when I really think about it that I would yearn for that a little bit, but I'm also not sure that that's not the right way to do it. Like when I look at the options we have for my dad in his form of illness, thank God we have insurance and things that can get him the care he needs. But the emotional piece of it is really hard to reconcile. And I'm grateful that he is making choices, with the best possible attitude about what we need to do to make sure he's cared for. But is it in a perfect world what I would do? No, I would tuck him in with me and we'd figure it out at home, So I don't know what to make of all that, but I'm at a real inflection point of realizing I'm buying into every day a system with my actions of a why that I'm not sure that I believe in. And it doesn't mean that I won't keep saving for retirement. It doesn't mean I don't believe in, 401ks or 403bs, but I am starting to question the fundamental premise of the way we've set some of this stuff up. And I'm doing that not just as a person, but also as someone running an organization. There are certain things we incentivize, and those things we incentivize are based on a certain theory of how one should live. And I just want to get really clear on that, so that the steps we're taking in terms of what we offer for our employees, in terms of the decisions I make for myself as an aging person, are really aligned to what I want to be true for the way I live and the way I live with my family and my community. And that's not just true for my family, it's also true for my friend group. One thing that really caught my attention is my parents were in one place for 27 years. And so when my mom passed, there were hundreds of people who still lived in her zip code, who brought casseroles and did all the things that you do when you're local. And that's not my life. Like, my closest friends are a short plane ride. Some of them not short plane ride, but they're plane ride away. And we are right now so focused on getting together, and we see each other and we're really disciplined about it. But at 80, 85, I don't think that strategy is going to work as well. And so I do wonder, like, what are we going to build for ourselves that keeps us together and supporting each other in the back half of our life, the way we have in the front half of our life, knowing that, we may develop mobility issues. We may need to be with each other longer than 5 days a quarter or whatever we're pulling off right now. And so they're all still questions for me, but I think they're questions that just weren't there 10 years ago. I wasn't thinking about it.
I'm grateful I get to talk to you now, Kriste, and everyone gets to hear your story, because we do have time. I have time. I can think about things differently. And it's so connected, Kriste, to even your journey and growing up with your parents and having them source yourself, like from yourself, like self-love. God is within you, as well as your purpose. Like, that's what you're here to do. And this is so connected. Like, what is my purpose with my family, with my parents, my children? Like, let's figure that out before I feed the system and just mindlessly go through it without this consciousness, these conscious decisions. So I love that. And I'm wondering, this Pahara reading, I'm going to bring it up. And it's about the happiest people, and you might remember it, but the happiest people, what they have in common is they actually are very community oriented. It was like back in the day, but they still live this way today. But people used to stay in one spot for generations. They lived in this community, the whole community, the family lived in a house, like a big house, and different floors, but everyone had a spot. They all helped each other. There was no my family and your family. It was like all the family working together. And yes, there was drama, but we're all in it. And that is actually, it's been like research based, like that is where the happiest community has been. And so much of it resonates. It's this like learning and integration. So thank you for sharing these insights. And before we do our lightning round, I want to get your reflection, Kriste, because social emotional learning, diverse communities, building citizens of the world, you talk a lot about belonging and how you felt, yes, I'm included, but I don't really belong. And I found belonging here in LA, even with my very close friends, a plane ride away. So I'd love for could you share and reflect on what does it mean for you to belong? How do you know you belong where you belong now? And how do you build belonging? So that's a meaty question. Feel free to take it wherever you'd like, but just belonging.
Yeah. I do think that my move away from home allowed me the opportunity to immerse myself in communities of values aligned people, not really like-minded, because I actually think there's some pretty serious diversity of perspective and thought in my broader circle, but there is a values alignment that I really appreciate. And I don't know that was present for me as much when I was a child. So that's one thing that I think has carried me and brought me great joy in my adult life. I also think I've relaxed a little bit on there being one community that serves anything. like I have different communities for different things. And I don't want to make it sound transactional because it doesn't feel that way at all. But, when you're parenting, I feel like there are people that, but for the fact that we're parenting kids who really love each other, we might not be that close. And yet we find this real intimacy in raising our kids together. And as my oldest has gotten older, I've seen some of those relationships then sort of fall into the background, but instrumental for, 2 decades as my oldest, for example, was getting older. So I've just settled into that being part of life, and that's okay. And I don't know that that was my mindset when I first sort of landed with my first child. I was looking for my people, and they were going to be my people for everything. And I don't know that it really works that way. And then the last thing I'd say, which is maybe a newer discovery for me, is that this notion of belonging also just requires a lot of self-awareness and self-understanding. So I think it's interesting the internal barriers that we throw up for ourselves that actually we keep throwing up from environment to environment, but they're about us. They're actually not about what's happening externally. But I think we can tell ourselves story. I can tell myself a story about how it's not something that's innate to me. And so as I've done more personal work, personal development, really pushed myself to frankly get clear on when something is me and when it's my ego, then the more belonging I found, probably because the more authentically I can connect and the more authentically I can be vulnerable. And those are pretty important threshold issues for, I think, deep human connection and relationship.
Kriste, I hear values alignment. I hear it doesn't have to be everything. Although the one community doesn't have to deliver all my needs. And I also hear a self-awareness to see, is it me or is it my ego? Do you mind sharing an example from me versus ego? Because that would be really helpful to understand. How do you know? It could be them.
Yeah, this is the whole process of one's own development is just it's fascinating to me. And the way that I ended up getting into some of this is that when we were creating the social and emotional development framework, and we were talking about things like self-regulation, like things that would sound very familiar, but things that obviously when you look at the adults in our world and the problems we're having, they'd be great skills for us to hone in the early years. And so I started to dip my toe in this, what I would call a human development sector that seemed very out of touch with education. Like I had been credentialed, I had been working in schools, and there didn't seem to be the overlap that probably there should be with the folks who are studying human development and then the folks who are actually educating and developing the humans in our society. So I thought that was interesting. But so much of the work is about understanding my own triggers, my own default behaviors, and the things that I do when I'm operating out of a place of not plugged into the source of who I actually really want to be, and more out of, some reactionary mode that usually is tied to my ego. So I can't think of a great example of how that has, I'm trying to think of a very concrete micro example. I can tell you a broader pattern that I've seen, and we've been doing some pretty deep, now a couple organizations in, I've been working with the Enneagram as it's really more than a tool, but as a tool to frame self-development or frame the development of self-awareness. And my default sort of way of thinking is success and failure. And that's not necessarily true for other people, but it is true for me. It's like, that's my motivating sort of through line. And it's been interesting to just become aware of the places where I will take action fearing failure, when I could actually choose to take action in alignment with what I think is the right thing to do or the better thing for the world. Sometimes those things align, sometimes they don't. But I think the more aware I can become of where fear, for me, it's fear of failure, is driving my decisions at a really subtle, like deep, not necessarily explicit level, but the more honest and aware I can become of that, the more likely I am to be operating out of true purpose and with true alignment to what I was born to do.
Wow. Kriste, I'm so happy to have this conversation with you. I am personally taking away so much for myself, for my life, my family, my own children. We're going to mix it up a bit, Kriste, with some lightning round questions. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay. Chocolate or vanilla?
Vanilla.
Cooking or takeout?
Takeout.
Climb a mountain or jump from a plane?
Jump from a plane.
Have you ever worn socks with sandals?
I'm embarrassed to admit that when I take my dog out in the morning. And when it's cold, I sometimes do wear socks with sandals.
How would you rate your karaoke skills on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being Mariah Carey?
Four,
What's a recent book you read?
falling upward, Richard Rohr.
What's your favorite way to practice self-care?
Walking meditations.
What's a good professional development you've done?
The Pahara Fellowship.
What's your definition of a boss mama?
Someone who is realizing their individual potential, contributing to the realizing of other people's potentials, and strengthening connections, human connections between people.
What advice would you give your younger self?
You have what you need, and God
And
is within you, I think.
hmm, and any final thoughts or recommendations to share with the audience?
I'm just so grateful for the conversation. When I'm doing things like this, I can't actually imagine that it's going to be helpful to anyone. So if it is, I'm so grateful. But I feel deep gratitude to the other folks who have worked with you and been highlighted in this forum or others. I wish we did more of this more often, more of these kinds of conversations.
Kriste, thank you so much for your vulnerability, your stories, the wisdom. As I shared, I'm taking away so much. So thank you so much for being willing to share with others.
Thank you. Thank you so much.